everyone, and thank you for listening. I'm your host, Kerrie Jordan. Welcome to our show where we hear from manufacturing and supply chain leaders who are driving the future of these industries. Today, I'm speaking with James Butler, the Senior Vice President, Chief Supply Chain, and Corporate Strategy Officer at Brinker International. This is one of the world's leading casual dining restaurant companies. They're headquartered in Dallas, Texas. Brinker owns, operates, and franchises over 1,600 casual dining restaurants worldwide under the names Chili's Grill and Bar and Maggiano's Little Italy. The company also operates virtual brands, including It's Just Wings. Now, my guest, James Butler, oversees the company's supply chain operations, including procurement, food safety and quality assurance, distribution and logistics, brand program management, and supply chain systems for Brinker's corporate-owned restaurants. He also leads the corporate strategy team, aligning strategic initiatives with the company's long-term growth goals. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. I love these restaurants. James, welcome, and thank you for joining the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Kerrie, and thanks for that amazing introduction.
Absolutely. Well, let's get to know you. Would you share a bit about your career journey and what led you to Brinker International?
Yeah, certainly. You look back and all the journey makes sense, but it's a little bit of a roundabout way. I actually started my career in sales and marketing. So that was what I was classically trained in. Coming out of the University of Kentucky, I majored in marketing and in finance. I did that career for about 5 years. I was selling a lot of manufacturing related products, stretch wrappers, packaging equipment. So I spent a lot of time in the manufacturing environment in industrial areas. I went back to get my MBA at Vanderbilt, and that led me to consulting. I worked at Deloitte Consulting for 9 years, originally going in for the strategy space, corporate strategy, but quickly found a home in our supply chain practice, leading strategies for consumer products companies. I did that for about as long as I could survive in consulting before I wanted to actually get into a company where I felt like I could drive the plans to execution. And went to Georgia Pacific. So I worked in the paper processing space. I was in the consumer division leading their supply chain strategy for products you may know, like Angel Soft toilet paper, Dixie plateware, Brawny paper towels. While there, I got a call from a recruiter who said, "Hey, would you like to come back to Kentucky and lead the supply chain for KFC?" I jumped at that opportunity. It's such a well-known brand from my home state, and it was the opportunity to really drive some change for a company that needed it so desperately. Had a great time there, learned a ton working with the leadership team from Yum Brands, some really great restaurant executives. And along the way, I actually met our current CEO at Brinker, Kevin Hochman. He took the role of CEO for Brinker International, and I jumped at the opportunity to go lead the supply chain for him, and have done so while also building up an internal strategy capability and leading a lot of our cross-functional programs here for Brinker in our 2.5-year turnaround.
That's interesting because you spent such time at such well-known brands. That's great. So your role now is really fascinating because it sort of sits at the intersection of supply chain and corporate strategy. And I can only imagine this is such a dynamic role, and these two functions are really very much intertwined. So it's a fascinating role that you have these responsibilities. What drew you to this leadership position?
I've always been enamored with how things work and, getting the puzzle pieces together. I like getting my hands dirty. When I'm at home, I'm building things. So supply chain was always a natural fit for me. But I also have that intellectual curiosity to think like, what's next and how do you drive the business forward? I love being able to play in both spaces because as your audience will relate, manufacturers and supply chain leaders often have to execute upon the promises that the commercial division makes, and a lot of the over promises that they make. So when we can be at the forefront of developing that strategy, not limiting it in any way, but definitely having our hand in, what's the art of the possible and how do we actually bring it to life, we can be so much more effective. And that's always given me a lot of fulfillment in my career.
That's great. Okay. And so prior to Brinker, you had mentioned you were working with KFC and Yum Brands and leading that supply chain. And it sounds like there were some challenges. What did you learn from your time there that helped you to prepare for what you do now with Brinker?
So I was with Yum and KFC through the pandemic, which was an incredible time to be leading the supply chain through so much disruption and change.
Yes.
I was fortunate enough to be with a company like Yum, who had such great leadership at the executive level. I felt so supported in everything that we were going through, and was actually given a lot of responsibility and leeway to make some decisions, through my team. But we went through product shortages, we went through steep inflation, we went through guests having all sorts of new demands and new buying patterns. So every day was new for us, and there was a lot of challenges, but there was also the acceptance, like, hey, let's just get our best, our best foot forward. Let's just do exactly, what we can do and no more, no less. So it was, a tremendous opportunity. It was also my introduction to the restaurant industry, to be able to get back into a space where, the work that we did, you could see it. You could see it on your plate. I could call my 92-year-old grandmother and tell her what I'm doing, and she understood it. That's something that I've always really appreciated, to be able to share those stories with my family members, and they know exactly what, I know what a bucket of chicken looks like, and I can figure out what you're doing. So that was a lot of fun.
What were some of the demands that they had? I mean, just we can all relate. We all went to restaurants and things during the pandemic, or at least tried to, and it was very difficult. Like, we had to have food delivered, really. What were some of the things that people had demanded of you?
Well, I think you would just in that time, KFC was very used to serving the guest off premise, but it was a lot more drive through and
Right.
shorter durations. You started seeing delivery, and you started seeing like total home replacement. So you were going from, serving a small subset to a much larger group. At the same time, you have a new generation who's being introduced to a brand that they may not have been to for a while. KFC made its name with buckets of chicken and chicken on the bone. My kids will probably never eat chicken on the bone. That's not, they want nuggets, they want strips. So, it was taking an existing product that KFC had and really leaning into it, growing that product. At the same time, we were launching a chicken sandwich. So, working with suppliers during the pandemic, developing a product, getting on Zoom calls and reviewing products when it was not really quite feasible to be in person. A lot of those challenges, just made us think differently. But I look at where I am today, and it's really driving a lot of efficiency in what we've done. Where we always had to send people out to plants and suppliers and warehouses, we've been able to do some of those things just through the technologies that are available to us today.
I talk about supply chain disruption and, what's happening now. I mean, I can imagine that your time then had really helped to prepare you for the disruption that we see now today. But if we can go a little bit earlier in your career too, you mentioned the consulting work with Deloitte. What were some of the lessons that you learned from your consulting days that still guide your decision making now?
I never would have put it this eloquently, but there's a great book out now by the co-founder of Waze, and it's Fall in Love with the Problem, Not the Solution. What I learned in consulting was, like, you got to really dig layer upon layer to understand, what is creating the complexity, the constraint, or the challenges within the business. Oftentimes, your first reaction is, I'm going to put in a technology, or I'm going to change this process. And what you can find if you really fall in love and eat, sleep, and drink the problem is there's a number of factors that are influencing that. And at the same time, you get to know, the people that are involved, the operators, and that gives you a sense of, okay, the solution has to be bound to also what are people going to accept and how they're going to execute it. So, I think it's taught me to continue to ask, well, why do we do it that way? Why is it this way? Could it be done a different way? And often leads to a lot of good solutions that never would have, just jumped off the plate had you just thought about fixing the problem and moving on.
Okay, so you have worked in a number of different industries: consulting, manufacturing, restaurants. So, as a leader, how have the experiences across these different industries shaped your perspective of leading a global supply chain?
When I worked across all these industries in the supply chain, you inevitably come to a conclusion that whatever industry you're in, it's all creative problem solving. It's all figuring out where the constraints are and where your bottlenecks are and solving for that. I used to joke, I could work at Nike or I could work at Kraft, and it's all just numbers in Excel boxes, right? You're just moving things around. Now that's oversimplifying things, and there's value in being in a plant and understanding, how things are made. But at the end of the day, it's just how do you make things better? Where are your constraints? What should you focus on? Blocking out the noise of everything else that really doesn't matter, and most importantly, helping to build a vision that your team can run towards and understanding what success looks like and how they then layer into that success. So wherever I've worked, I've tried to develop and build really flat organizations. I want the people that are on the front lines to feel like they have a direct line to me, but also have a lot of responsibility over their problem. I always say I want owners, and to have owners, you have to give them enough for them to want to own it. So wherever I would work, you want to make sure that you give people autonomy, that you give them a sense that they really can make a difference and that they know what making a difference, what the value in that is.
I love that. The way you just articulated that is so well said, because if you are going to empower people, if you are going to enable them and give them autonomy, they have to have enough ownership in order to be able to really run with it. So that's great. I love that you described it that way. So I want to bust some myths here with you on this podcast about
Mhm.
supply chain management in the restaurant industry. It's interesting speaking with you, and we're kind of getting the behind the scenes view, but so many of us, of course, go to restaurants or order from restaurants, or, what are some of the biggest misconceptions about the supply chain management in the restaurant industry that you wish that people understood?
So I think for years we were just called like the buying group or the procurement organization because we are the front lines working with the suppliers that provide the food ingredients to our restaurants. But we do so much more of that. We're not just buyers, we're not just crisis managers. We're really thinking 18, 24 months out on, capacity. So look at my Chili's restaurants. We are growing at such a clip today that we have real constraints around the amount of hamburger meat that we can serve, chicken that we can, getting French fries to the restaurants. It's not an immediate capacity constraint, but if we continue to grow at this clip, like we've got to make sure that we have, that we're thinking through those scenarios. We've got to think about, I've got restaurants now that 2 deliveries a week, just we can't get enough groceries to the restaurant. So how do I get them a third delivery? How do I make that delivery smoother for the operator so my restaurant manager isn't just an inventory clerk? They're still on the floor working with the guests. So there's a lot of things that we do that kind of everything upstream we want to make as seamless as possible. I always tell the team, I'm fine if the restaurant manager just thinks of us as the group that buys things for them. That's fine, because that means we're doing our job. That means they put in an order and the groceries show up. There's so much more that we have to do up front, but we love it, and that's why we show up every day.
That's interesting. And you just reminded me of a story. My brother worked at a fast food restaurant many years ago. And I won't name it, but it's not one that you had mentioned or that you've worked with. But I remember one time he was working at the drive-through window and they ran out of straws. And customers just got so frustrated because how in the drive-through, right? You're driving and you got your drink and you're trying to drink, and how can you do this without a straw? So it was just so frustrating. And I can imagine that as long as you have the supplies there, the rest the groceries, and they're just there, then like you said, you're just doing the job and things get to move smoothly. And then you avoid those upset customers.
I love that point.
Yeah.
You hear a lot of people saying, here's my critical items that I monitor, and here's my ABC categorization. What we learned during the pandemic was when that C-level SKU is out, you're in big trouble, right? Like we had a liner paper that was used for cooking our biscuits so they didn't stick to the pan. Biscuits are a big mover at KFC. When that ran out, we couldn't make biscuits. And so we tracked all the biscuit mix and all of those things. We weren't looking at the liner paper because it was never deemed critical. And so I've used that lesson, here at Chili's and in Maggiano's, like, what we consider critical should be what we talk about every day, but everything when out is critical.
Yes, it's interesting. All these little pieces have such a critical role, and you have to keep in mind all of them. And even when you do your prioritization, that is interesting. So, speaking of food distribution logistics, how do you do this at scale? And is there an element of technology involved?
Oh, certainly. So,
Okay.
so we have thousands of suppliers. We work across a number of distributors who maintain our inventory for us and have to deliver to all of our restaurants. What's most important to us on a daily basis that is that we know, were the groceries delivered to our restaurant as promised that day, and if they weren't, we didn't know exactly what it was, and how do we track that down, and that takes a lot of integration. Just it's data plans upon data plans in terms of what are we looking at from a forecast? Which suppliers do these need to come from? Because we dictate that. We build these relationships on where our raw material comes from. And are they set up to receive orders and POs and all of those things? But most importantly of all of that, while it's really important that we make sure our restaurants have the ingredients, my team has to make sure that we understand lot codes and where everything comes from. If we ever did have a quality issue, if we ever had a food safety concern, if we ever had something that was to violate the cold chain and, product is no longer temperature controlled. We review that every day because, job number one, while it's really fun to sell burgers and fries, like we've got to make sure our guests and our team members are safe and well taken care of in that regard.
Given your experience in the different places that you've worked, if you could reflect upon maybe some of the differences between supply chain at a manufacturing organization versus a restaurant company. If you've seen any significant technology adoption gaps, maybe if one is doing something differently from the other and, you've kind of used that as a lesson learned, like how do these compare
Sure.
from your experience?
There is a gap, obviously. And so I did consulting for a number of the big retailers and also their suppliers. And, you'd have a retailer or a grocer who is sharing real-time checkout data in terms of product that's moving. And that's building manufacturing plans at your supplier. It's so heavily integrated and you're sharing information back and forth. Vendor managed inventory is really big in the consumer product space. So, both sides knowing kind of what product's available and how do I sell that through. That scale, a large retailer, a big box, and a large supplier is heavily leveraged and well executed. I think when you get down to the restaurant level, and the one thing I've appreciated, no matter how much product we sell, it doesn't compare to what the retailers are doing from a grocery perspective, just in terms of volume. And you have dedicated plants to certain retailers where we may have a dedicated line or a couple of lines, so you see some of those gaps, but we've been trying to close those a little bit. And I think my experience with working some of these large food manufacturers in a CPG capacity has allowed me to say, hey, look, I know these technologies are available. I know you leverage them at another plant. How do we embed that into the work that we're doing while we're also building capabilities here at Brinker, to level up our planners and to build capacity plans that our suppliers can use. So at Deloitte, I spent a lot of time on the manufacturing floor, and I feel like I've got a good sense of what can make a manufacturer really effective. And, that's part of what we've been doing through our partnership model is like, hey, we know we can make you a more effective manufacturer. It's going to improve our availability of product. And, maybe we can share in some of those cost synergies as well.
So that actually brings me to my next question around efficiencies. Curious how at Brinker, you mentioned the food safety element, and I can imagine that managing food safety priorities alongside operational efficiency priorities could be difficult. Like there must be a balance to that you must hit in order to manage these. How do you do that? How do you manage both?
No, that's a great question. I don't know that I would say that I balance it. I think, I tell my team, our vision is to be the world's leading restaurant supply chain organization, and that really comes down to 5 pillars that I've ordered in exactly their level of importance. And the very first one is food safety and quality. Like if we can't deliver food safe product that also is within our spec, and then for a number of reasons, it's important, not just for what you're expecting, Kerrie, to eat, but our cooks need the product to come in as they expect it, so they know how to prepare it and move it, forward in a safe manner. The second one then would be the product's got to be available, right? And so while they're 1 and 2, that food safety, we never sacrifice that. So that always is our leading edge. And we will not work with a supplier who doesn't meet our very high standards, and we audit that regularly to make sure they're doing those things. Once we work with those suppliers that we know are doing it the right way, then we get into, okay, how do we do it the most effective way? And that's where it bleeds into kind of cost management and innovation, productivity initiatives, and then overall, how do we look at risk? But I wouldn't say I balance it, but we lead with that, and then we immediately roll up our sleeves and go, okay, now knowing those constraints, how do we do this the best way possible?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so now onto supply chain disruption, bringing it back, thinking about all the stories that you've already shared. How do you build resilience into the supply chain within the restaurant industry to avoid those kinds of disruptions?
When you get into supply chain, I think you kind of have a desire to work on things that are broken and to fix things. And we have a lot of firefighters in supply chain. I'm sure some of your listeners will say, "Hey, I'm a firefighter. My team's firefighters." When I got to Brinker, I greeted everyone and said, "Hey, look, we're all firefighters. We all put out fires every day. That's why we're here. But what I really need is more fire preventers." And I actually have a signature award that I give out every quarter to the department. I've got it right here. It's my Smokey Bear Award. I give out the Smokey Bear Award to the fire preventer of the quarter who came up with a process, an idea, or is just organizing the data way that helped us solve something, sniffed out an issue before it became a problem.
That's great.
And when you do those things, then people start to have the mindset of like, yeah, I get it. Firefighting is what I do, but I'm rewarded and I'm recognized when I build a stronger supply chain. I mean, so you've got to embed that into your culture. And when you embed it into your culture, you start to see that manifest all over the place.
And actually, because I love that concept of the fire prevention, and it does actually bring me to my next question, which is around driving growth. Because I can imagine if you're, resolving those issues before they even become a problem, that now you're building growth and creating value within the supply chain. How do you, especially in your role, with both corporate strategy and supply chain, how do you align corporate strategy with the supply chain operations in order to drive corporate growth?
We spend a lot of time as a leadership team on the supply chain in our restaurants. And we sit there with the menu, we sit there as guests, we sit in the heart of house, and we really understand, what are the guests ordering? Why are they ordering it? Like, why do they like this mozzarella cheese stick? Oh, it's because it has this amazing cheese pull, and it's creamy, it's gooey, it's delicious. It's got the right savory notes. We take all of those learnings and then go back to our suppliers and have those same conversations. Like, this is why the product's moving, because the guest likes this. This is what the guest wants. But we're also spending time with those managers of those restaurants, really asking them, how could we support you to do your job better? What are things that disrupt you from being with the guest or being with your new cook and teaching them, the Chili's way to make a product, how to grill the perfect hamburger. And as you learn those things and you start to pull those things off of the manager's plate, you see the delight that they get to actually be in the restaurant and do what they wanted to do, right? People go into the restaurant business to serve great food and to be, to demonstrate hospitality with guests. They don't go to, run inventory of their proteins in the refrigerator or call the distributor and ask, where's my product? When we eliminate those things, the growth engine really just goes.
James, after you're talking about those cheese sticks, now I'm hungry. What's your favorite meal at Chili's or at Maggiano's?
So I have the pleasure of getting to go to the test kitchen every other week and try something amazing. I've always been a fajita guy. I
Nice.
love fajitas, but if it's a lunch, our burger is second to none, and it always hits just right. We got a good variety. I'm right now stuck on the Big Smasher, which is just this amazingly executed burger with the French fries. I'm a glutton for French fries, so that's where I'll be. If you find me over at Maggiano's, I mean, you can just close your eyes and grab something from our rigatoni D to our new vodka sauce pasta, which is pretty awesome.
This all sounds amazing. I cannot wait to go next. Okay, so when it comes to supply chain technology, what have you found to be the most effective when you are working with the teams to implement these new technologies?
The biggest lessons I've learned over many planning software implementations, data migrations is like, I don't know if you can spend too much time up front understanding how value can be created and like what the optimal process should be. I've seen too many organizations jump right into this software is going to solve everything. And then they're redesigning processes to fit within the software versus understanding, how their core, how their work really should flow. I think we've gotten a lot better with a lot of the SaaS software that's very fungible and can be tailored. But there's still something you said about just getting a team in the room, figuring out, if we had no constraints, what would be the best way to operate, and then using that as your North Star around how do you build the optimal workflows and processes, and then find the technology that fits versus trying to fit to a technology.
I love that. Getting the people, getting your team in the room and just talking through these problems, especially when you have, so many folks that are just passionate about solving problems, being within supply chain. When it comes to certain types of processes as part of supply chain, maybe as forecasting, inventory management. Do you leverage data analytics or some other type of tool for visibility purposes?
We do. We have a great technology that allows all of our suppliers, our distributors in our restaurants to link together so we can see how products moving through the system. And then we can take that and run statistical models on around how products moving in demand software. We don't spend as much on the demand planning as I did probably 10 years ago. So a lot of my work in consulting was, let me get you the right demand model. And if we can get your made from 79 to 85 or in the 90s, look how good things will be. What I learned, Kerrie, during the pandemic was like the demand plans go out the window if you can't execute. And we knew exactly what our demand was when I was trying to get those chicken sandwiches out there. We just couldn't make it fast enough.
Yeah.
So at Brinker, we spend a lot more time upstream on the supply plan, the capacity planning, scenario planning. What if volume shifts up 20%? What if it comes down 20%? We do demand forecasting, but we don't go to the level of detail that I probably would have done a decade ago, because what I've recognized is understanding your guardrails and really challenging, are those the right options that are going to make you successful? Then you give your team the opportunity to make some decisions in real time, versus trying to set plans 4 weeks out and then just hope it's the right execution.
Wow, 4 weeks. I mean, you're right. When I can imagine people in the restaurant, they're sitting down. You got to get them their food like right away. So making sure that you have the supplies there. It's all about that execution. And that's interesting how this shift has happened from demand planning now more focus on the execution. It's fascinating to see these kinds of like trends change.
Inventory always gets this, it's very polarizing in the industry, and
Yeah.
not just our industry, every industry. But I worked at one point for a cosmetics manufacturer. They had like an anti-aging cream. They had almost 400 days of inventory, and immediately as a consultant, we're like, we got to fix this. There's 400 days of inventory, and their chief supply chain officer and chief commercial officer were meeting with us, and the commercial officer said, "Look, this cost a couple dollars to make. We sell it for a couple $100. Like, we will keep as much inventory as we need." Now, I don't have the luxury of having products with those margins. It did teach me, inventory is only bad if it costs more than the opportunity cost of not making the sale.
Yeah.
And that's a hard lesson to teach supply chain people, because you're very focused on efficiency and productivity. But when you can really break those economic terms down into, understand what the cost is of having too much inventory, but also let's understand the cost of having too little.
Well said. Sustainability. How do you see these types of priorities sort of reshaping supply chain? I mean, maybe what it's already done to reshape supply chains, but then also in the coming years.
I have always devoted a portion of my time throughout my career, even my time at Vanderbilt, to responsible sourcing and productivity initiatives. I was a part of an organization that in grad school that really focused in on this. And now I'm a father of three, and I'm thinking about how do I leave the world better for my beautiful children. Like, it's super important to me. And I do think as big, big restaurant companies that we can make a big difference. Brinker does a lot of amazing things in terms of trying to get to the best sourced products, the most responsible way to get things to our guests and our team members. So we definitely have open conversations with our suppliers on a regular basis around, how do we continue to just get a little bit better than we were last year, whether that's emissions, it's the ingredients that we put into our food or the products that we use to package our product.
When you're working with your suppliers, do they have their emissions data? Are they tracking sustainability initiatives, or are you specifically choosing ones that are tracking? Just curious how that's.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think you're still seeing the industry trying to align upon what the right standards are. We work with a lot of the same food providers that provide products to the large grocers, and they have systems that have been built because of the the way that those ecosystems work, and so we just leverage a lot of the same practices.
That's great. Yeah, interesting to see how that's evolving. And then I know there's a lot of pressure there, so that's great to hear, and great to hear your passion for this as well. So, especially I imagine within food supply chains, there might be some risk averse team members that you work with, perhaps some in leadership. How do you work with your teams and the leaders, maybe even your peers, when it comes to innovating for the future, maybe generating new ideas, and then sort of balancing that with a risk-averse nature, perhaps within supply chains? How do you manage that?
I think you have to figure out, like, when you talk about innovation, it's almost a framing exercise that can be different across organizations. So when I sit in the room with our marketing leaders, innovation is very much around the creativity. How do I meet where the guest is, where they're moving, and so you're using, it's like right brain, left brain. Like there's a lot of energy just around, like, what's new and exciting. How can we make that pop? How can we work it? And as a leader that then has to bridge that to our supply chain, it's almost like you translate that into a series of questions or problems that you want your supply chain leaders to go solve, because that's how they think. We're firefighters, we're problem solvers, we like to put together puzzles. So you kind of balance the two of those, and then when you get everyone in the room together, that's really where the creativity happens. So we love to bring our suppliers into our test kitchen and tell them what we're trying to do and leverage their industry data and expertise. And what you find is the like real innovation comes from the collective genius of everyone, and not just not just one individual. At Brinker and at Chili's, a lot of that does come from our culinary team, who knows what they want to do. They come up with amazing recipes, whether it's Chili's or Maggiano's. I mean, just the most craveable things that you could have. And then we've got to then, like, almost dissect that to, like, okay, well, like, how do we make that happen at 1,200 restaurants, 24 hours a day, like every day of the year?
You mentioned your team a lot, and it sounds like you recognize them quite a lot. You showed the award that you give. So I bet, if you're investing a lot in your team and you seem passionate about what you do, very clearly passionate, I'm sure that helps to generate excitement, enthusiasm, and to come up with those kinds of ideas that you can then scale across, not just within one restaurant, but of course, all of your restaurants. You're going to need to have some pretty forward thinking in that room. So it's really interesting to hear. Do you have any guidance that you would pass on to other leaders, maybe in supply chain, maybe in the restaurant or manufacturing, maybe even to those in consulting, that you would pass on? Maybe if they're looking to, future-proof their operations, or maybe take their organization to the next level. And even, sorry, it would be interesting to hear too, it's the supply chain leadership role, chief supply chain officers, VP of supply chain. These are somewhat emerging. There are many out there, but I think not quite as prevalent yet as to probably what we need. Do you have any advice for people who are thinking about getting into that career as well? So general guidance for all of those listening in.
So let me start with the team. This applies anywhere. I mean, I would tell anyone this: when you're building your team, hire owners, hire people that want to not only own what they're responsible for, but really feel like they have skin in the game for owning the overall objective of whatever it is you sell. I want everyone in my department to feel like that is their restaurant. And if they go into Chili's, like they can make a difference in making it better. But it's not enough to just hire owners. And I think we talked about this earlier. You have to empower them to feel like they have enough responsibility that they can really own something and make some decisions. And then you give them enough, enough grace to make some mistakes. So they really do take chances. Because you can do all of those things separately, but if you don't do them in concert, then you're not going to get to the secret sauce. As you think about how you evolve your career, you're going to grow in supply chain if you truly demonstrate that ownership of not just your department, but the broader business. And you can demonstrate how the role that your supply chain or that manufacturing plays in value creation for the enterprise, and that you understand the business that you're in, why you're in business, what's your reason for being as an organization, and then you understand how to cascade that down to your team.
That's great because, I mean, supply chain is so core to the business and operational growth. And any final thoughts for the audience that I didn't ask you about?
Look, this has been a joy. What I tell people all the time is, as supply chain leaders, we don't reach out to each other enough and just talk about the challenges that we're facing. And one of the things I found, from coming from so many different diverse companies, is I learned so much when I can reach out to a leader in the healthcare space or in the technology space and just ask them, like, what are they doing about a certain challenge? Sometimes it works in the restaurant space, sometimes it doesn't. But again, I go back to a lot of what we do is very similar, just in a different wrapper. So everyone that's listening out there, if you're facing a challenge, reach out to someone that's in a different industry. They may have a neat perspective. It'll get you thinking, at least.
That's really good guidance. Well, this has been such a great conversation. It's been a pleasure to learn from your experience. For anybody who wants to learn more about Brinker International, where would you direct them?
Well, you can turn on your TV. You're going to see us all day long. And then come into our restaurant first. Come into a Chili's, come into Maggiano, see what we do best. And then I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me. I'd love to answer any questions that you have, or I can be one of those industry leaders that you just want to chat with.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, James. This has been a wonderful conversation.
All right. Thanks, Kerrie. Thanks for having me. I loved it.
Absolutely. All right. That was James Butler, Senior Vice President and Chief Supply Chain and Corporate Strategy Officer at Brinker International. And to everyone listening, thank you for being a part of the future of manufacturing.